Chapter 1. The Curious Invitation. The morning sun streamed through the lace curtains of Hercule Poirot's London flat, casting delicate patterns on the polished wooden floor. Poirot sat at his breakfast table, meticulously arranging his toast into perfect squares. His sharp eyes flicked to the Morning Post, where an unusual envelope caught his attention. It was made of thick, cream-coloured paper, sealed with a wax stamp bearing the emblem of a mask. "Curious," Poirot murmured, picking up the envelope with his characteristic precision. He slit it open with a silver letter-opener and extracted a single sheet of parchment. The handwriting was elegant, yet hurried, as if the writer had been in a state of agitation. "Monsieur Hercule Poirot, you are cordially invited to a masquerade ball at Blackwood Manor, hosted by Lord Alistair Blackwood. The event will take place on the 15th of this month. Your presence is requested not only for the festivities, but also to unravel a matter of grave importance. The Ivory Mask holds the key to a deadly secret. I trust your discretion and brilliance will shed light on the darkness that looms over this house. Yours sincerely, Lord Alistair Blackwood." Poirot's eyebrows rose slightly. He had heard of Lord Blackwood, a reclusive art collector known for his eccentric tastes and vast fortune. The mention of the Ivory Mask intrigued him. He had encountered references to such artifacts in his studies, but never in the context of a modern mystery. "A masquerade ball," Poirot mused aloud, tapping the letter against his chin. "And a deadly secret. Très intéressant." His valet, Georges, entered the room with a fresh pot of tea. "Something troubling you, monsieur?" "Non, Georges," Poirot replied, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. "On the contrary, I believe we are about to embark on a most intriguing adventure. Prepare my evening attire. I shall require my finest suit and, of course, a mask." As Georges left to carry out his instructions, Poirot leaned back in his chair, his mind already racing with possibilities. The Ivory Mask, a deadly secret, and a masquerade ball where every face would be hidden, every motive concealed. It was the perfect stage for deception, and for Hercule Poirot to shine. Chapter 2. The Masquerade of Shadows. The carriage rolled to a halt at the gates of Blackwood Manor, its iron bars intricately wrought with motifs of ivy and masks. Poirot stepped out, adjusting his gloves and smoothing the lapels of his impeccably tailored evening suit. His mask, a simple yet elegant black domino, rested lightly on his face, its edges catching the flickering light of the torches that lined the driveway. The manor loomed ahead, its Gothic spires piercing the night sky. Shadows danced across its stone facade, and the faint strains of a waltz drifted through the air. Poirot's sharp eyes took in every detail: the overgrown hedges, the faint glow of candlelight in the upper windows, and the faint scent of roses, mingling with the crisp autumn air. As he approached the grand entrance, the doors swung open to reveal a butler, with a face as impassive as a statue. "Monsieur Hercule Poirot," the butler intoned, bowing slightly. "Lord Blackwood awaits you in the ballroom." Poirot inclined his head and stepped inside. The interior of Blackwood Manor was as opulent as it was unsettling. Crystal chandeliers cast a soft glow over the marble floors, their light reflecting off gilded mirrors and ornate tapestries. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax, and something else, something faintly metallic, like the tang of old blood. The ballroom was a spectacle of colour and movement. Guests in elaborate masks and costumes twirled across the floor, their laughter echoing off the high ceilings. Poirot's gaze swept the room, noting the subtle dynamics at play, the nervous glances, the whispered conversations, the way certain guests seemed to avoid one another. At the far end of the room, a man in a silver mask stood apart from the crowd, his posture rigid and his hands clasped behind his back. Poirot recognized him at once, Lord Alistair Blackwood. The host's mask covered the upper half of his face, but his piercing blue eyes were unmistakable. They darted around the room as if searching for something or someone. Poirot made his way through the throng, his presence drawing curious glances. When he reached Lord Blackwood, the man turned to him with a slight bow. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, his voice low and urgent, "I'm grateful you came. The pleasure is mine," Poirot replied, his tone polite but probing. "Your invitation was most intriguing. You mentioned an ivory mask and a deadly secret. Perhaps you would care to elaborate?" Lord Blackwood hesitated, his eyes flicking to the crowd. "Not here," he murmured. "The walls have ears, but keep your eyes open, Monsieur Poirot. The ivory mask is here tonight, and its wearer is not to be trusted." Before Poirot could respond, a commotion near the entrance drew their attention. A woman in a striking emerald gown had just arrived, her face obscured by a mask of delicate gold filigree. She moved with an air of confidence, her every step commanding attention. But it was the man beside her who caught Poirot's eye. He wore a mask of pure ivory, its smooth surface unadorned except for a single crack running down the left side. "The ivory mask," Poirot murmured under his breath. Lord Blackwood's grip tightened on his cane. "Yes," he said grimly, "and its wearer is the one who holds the key to this mystery, and perhaps to my downfall." Poirot's eyes narrowed as he studied the masked figure. The man's movements were deliberate, almost theatrical, as if he were playing a role in some grand performance. But there was something else, a tension in his shoulders, a hesitation in his step, that suggested he was not entirely at ease. The waltz ended, and the room erupted into applause. The ivory mask wearer turned his head slightly, his gaze locking with Poirot's for the briefest of moments. Then he melted into the crowd, disappearing as quickly as he had appeared. Poirot turned to Lord Blackwood. "Who is he?" The host's jaw tightened. "That," he said, "is what I need you to find out." Chapter 3. The Vanishing Guest. The ballroom buzzed with laughter and music, but Poirot's attention remained fixed on the ivory mask wearer. The man had vanished into the crowd, leaving behind only a faint trail of unease. Poirot's little grey cells were already at work, piecing together the fragments of the puzzle. As he mingled with the guests, Poirot overheard snippets of conversation that piqued his interest. A woman in a peacock-feathered mask whispered to her companion, "Did you hear? Lord Blackwood's been acting strangely ever since the mask arrived." Another guest, a man in a harlequin costume, muttered, "They say the ivory mask is cursed. Bad luck follows it wherever it goes." Poirot's curiosity deepened. He approached a group of guests who were discussing the history of the mask. "Pardon me," he said, his voice polite but firm. "I could not help but overhear your conversation. What do you know of this ivory mask?" The guests exchanged uneasy glances. Finally, a woman in a ruby-red mask spoke up. "It's said to be an ancient artifact, monsieur. Legend has it that it once belonged to a queen who was betrayed by her closest confidant. She wore the mask to hide her tears, but it became a symbol of her vengeance. Anyone who possesses it is doomed to suffer." "Fascinating," Poirot said, his eyes gleaming. "And how did it come into Lord Blackwood's possession?" The woman hesitated. "That's the strange part. No one knows. It just appeared one day, along with a note warning of its curse." Before Poirot could press further, a sudden commotion erupted near the grand staircase. A maid, her face pale and her hands trembling, rushed into the ballroom. "Lord Blackwood!" she cried. "It's Mr. Whittaker. He's gone." The room fell silent. Lord Blackwood strode forward, his silver mask glinting in the candlelight. "What do you mean, gone?" The maid wrung her hands. "I went to fetch him for the next dance, but his room was empty. The window was open and this was on the floor." She held up a single ivory shard, its edges jagged and sharp. Poirot stepped forward, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. "May I?" he asked, holding out his hand. The maid handed him the shard, and he examined it closely. It matched the design of the ivory mask perfectly. "Where is Mr. Whittaker's room?" Poirot asked. "On the second floor, at the end of the east wing," the maid replied. Poirot turned to Lord Blackwood. "I suggest we investigate at once." The host nodded, his face grim. "This way." As they ascended the grand staircase, Poirot's mind raced. Mr. Whittaker, a renowned art critic and one of the evening's most prominent guests, had vanished without a trace. The open window suggested an escape, or perhaps a struggle. But the ivory shard was the most intriguing clue. What did it mean, and how did it connect to the ivory mask? When they reached Mr. Whittaker's room, Poirot took charge. The room was in disarray. The bed was unmade, the wardrobe doors hung open, and a chair lay overturned near the window. Poirot's keen eyes noted the faint scuff marks on the floor and the slight tear in the curtains. "He did not leave willingly," Poirot murmured, more to himself than to the others. He crossed to the window and peered out. The grounds below were dark and silent, the moonlight casting long shadows across the lawn. "What do you make of it, Monsieur Poirot?" Lord Blackwood asked, his voice tense. Poirot turned, holding up the ivory shard. "This is no ordinary piece of debris. It was placed here deliberately. A message, perhaps, or a warning. But from whom? And why?" Before Lord Blackwood could respond, a faint sound caught Poirot's attention. It was a low, almost imperceptible hum, like the vibration of a tuning fork. He followed the sound to the wardrobe, where he discovered a small hidden compartment. Inside was a folded piece of paper. Poirot unfolded it carefully, his eyes scanning the hastily scrawled words. "Beware the mask. It sees what others cannot, and it never forgets." The room seemed to grow colder as Poirot read the note aloud. Lord Blackwood's face paled beneath his mask. "This is madness," he muttered. "Sheer madness." Poirot's gaze was steady. "On the contrary, Lord Blackwood, this is a carefully orchestrated game. and I intend to uncover its rules and its players. Chapter 4. The Whispering Gallery. The discovery of the cryptic note in Mr. Whittaker's room left an air of unease hanging over Blackwood Manor. Poirot, ever the meticulous investigator, decided to explore the manor further. Convinced that the answers lay hidden within its walls, Lord Blackwood, though visibly shaken, agreed to accompany him. "There is a place you should see," Lord Blackwood said, his voice low. "The Whispering Gallery. It's an old part of the manor, rarely used now. But if there are secrets to be uncovered, they may lie there." Poirot's eyes sparkled with interest. "Lead the way, Lord Blackwood." They descended a narrow staircase, hidden behind a tapestry in the east wing. The air grew cooler as they moved deeper into the manor, the flickering light of Lord Blackwood's lantern casting eerie shadows on the stone walls. At last they reached a long, dimly lit corridor lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors. At the end of the corridor was an arched doorway, its heavy wooden door slightly ajar. "The Whispering Gallery," Lord Blackwood said, pushing the door open. The room beyond was unlike anything Poirot had ever seen. It was circular, with a high, domed ceiling adorned with intricate carvings of masks and faces. The walls were lined with alcoves, each containing a statue or a bust, but the most striking feature was the acoustics. Every sound, no matter how faint, seemed to echo and reverberate, creating a haunting chorus of whispers. "Remarkable," Poirot murmured, his voice carrying through the gallery. "It is as if the walls themselves are speaking." Lord Blackwood nodded. "Legend has it that the gallery was designed to amplify secrets. If you stand in the right spot, you can hear conversations from across the room, or even from other parts of the manor." Poirot's eyes gleamed with curiosity. A perfect place for intrigue, no? As they moved deeper into the gallery, Poirot noticed something unusual. One of the alcoves was empty, its pedestal covered in a fine layer of dust. But in the centre of the pedestal was a small circular indentation, a perfect match for the ivory shard he had found in Mr. Whittaker's room. "Fascinating," Poirot said, crouching to examine the indentation. "It seems the ivory mask was once displayed here. But why was it removed, and by whom?" Lord Blackwood's face darkened. "I had it moved after the incident with my wife. She was fascinated by the mask, but I always felt it brought bad luck. I stored it away, but it seems someone has taken it upon themselves to bring it back into the light." Poirot straightened, his mind racing. "And where is the mask now?" Before Lord Blackwood could answer, a faint sound caught Poirot's attention. It was a whisper, barely audible, but distinct. He turned his head, trying to locate its source. The sound seemed to come from one of the alcoves, where a statue of a woman with a serene expression stood. Poirot approached the statue, his sharp eyes scanning its surface. He noticed a small crack running along the base, almost imperceptible. With a gentle push, the statue shifted, revealing a hidden compartment behind it. Inside was a bundle of letters, tied with a faded ribbon. Poirot carefully untied the ribbon and began to read. The letters were written in a delicate feminine hand, and they spoke of love, betrayal, and a secret that could destroy a family. "These are your wife's letters," Poirot said, looking up at Lord Blackwood. "They mention a secret, one that someone would kill to protect." Lord Blackwood's face went pale. I had no idea these existed. My wife never spoke of them. Poirot's gaze was steady. It seems, Lord Blackwood, that the ivory mask is not the only thing hiding secrets in this manner, and I fear that Mr. Whittaker's disappearance is only the beginning. As if on cue, the lantern flickered, casting the gallery into momentary darkness. When the light returned, Poirot noticed something new. A faint symbol etched into the wall behind the statue. It was a mask, its features twisted into a sinister grin. "The mask sees what others cannot," Poirot murmured, recalling the note from Mr. Whittaker's room. "And it never forgets." Chapter 5. The Mask's Secret. The discovery of the hidden letters in the Whispering Gallery sent a ripple of tension through Poirot's mind. He carefully tucked them into his pocket, knowing they held the key to unravelling the mystery. Lord Blackwood, visibly shaken, led him back to the main hall, where the guests were still gathered, their masks now seeming more ominous than festive. "We must speak privately," Poirot said, his tone firm but calm. "There is much to discuss." Lord Blackwood nodded and guided Poirot to his study, a room lined with bookshelves and dominated by a large mahogany desk. The air was heavy with the scent of old leather and tobacco. Poirot took a seat, his sharp eyes scanning the room for any further clues. "Tell me about the ivory mask," Poirot began, leaning forward slightly. "Its history, its significance, and why it was removed from the Whispering Gallery." Lord Blackwood sighed, removing his silver mask and setting it on the desk. His face was lined with worry, and his hands trembled as he poured himself a glass of brandy. "The mask has been in my family for generations," he said. "It was said to be a gift from a foreign dignitary, a symbol of trust and alliance, but over time it became associated with darker things." "Such as?" Poirot prompted. Lord Blackwood hesitated, then continued. "There were stories, rumours, really, that the mask carried a curse. Those who possessed it met with misfortune. My great-grandfather died under mysterious circumstances shortly after acquiring it. My grandfather lost his fortune, and my father—" He trailed off, his voice faltering. "Your father?" Poirot pressed gently. "He went mad," Lord Blackwood said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He became obsessed with the mask, convinced it was alive. He would spend hours talking to it, as if it could hear him. In the end, he took his own life." Poirot's expression was thoughtful. "And your wife? What was her connection to the mask?" Lord Blackwood's face darkened. "She was fascinated by it. She believed the stories were nonsense, that as the mask was simply a beautiful artifact. But after her death—" He paused, his hands tightening around the glass. "I couldn't bear to look at it any more. I had it removed from the gallery and locked away." "And yet," Poirot said, "it has reappeared. Why now? And who would have the knowledge and the audacity to bring it back into the open?" Blackwood shook his head. "I don't know, but I fear it has something to do with Mr. Whittaker's disappearance. He was an expert on ancient artifacts, you see. He had expressed interest in the mask during his last visit." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "And what of the letters I found? They speak of a secret, one that your wife was privy to. What was she hiding?" Lord Blackwood's face went pale. I don't know. She never spoke of any secrets to me. But if those letters are genuine, then perhaps—" He trailed off, his voice choked with emotion. Poirot leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him. "It is clear, Lord Blackwood, that the ivory mask is at the centre of this mystery, but it is not merely an object. It is a symbol of betrayal, of vengeance, and of secrets that refuse to stay buried." He stood, his movements precise and deliberate. "I must examine the mask itself. Where is it now?" Lord Blackwood hesitated, then rose from his chair. "Follow me." He led Poirot to a hidden chamber behind a bookcase in the study. Inside was a small windowless room, its walls lined with velvet. In the centre of the room, on a pedestal, sat the ivory mask. Poirot approached it slowly, his eyes taking in every detail. The mask was exquisitely crafted, its surface smooth and unblemished, except for the faint crack running down one side. Its features were serene, almost lifelike, but there was something unsettling about it, a coldness, a sense of detachment. As Poirot studied the mask, he noticed something unusual, a faint inscription on the inside, barely visible in the dim light. He carefully turned the mask over and read the words aloud. "The truth lies beneath the mask." "What does it mean?" Lord Blackwood asked, his voice trembling. Poirot's eyes gleamed with excitement. "It means, Lord Blackwood, that the mask is not merely a symbol, it is a clue, and I intend to uncover the truth it hides." Chapter 4. 6. The Accusation. The inscription inside the ivory mask, "The truth lies beneath the mask," lingered in Poirot's mind as he returned to the ballroom. The guests were still gathered, their masks now seeming more like shields than disguises. The atmosphere was tense, the earlier merriment replaced by hushed whispers and furtive glances. Poirot's sharp eyes scanned the room, noting the subtle dynamics at play. The woman in the emerald gown, Lady Beatrice, as he had learned, stood near the fireplace, her gold filigree mask glinting in the firelight. The man in the harlequin costume was engaged in a heated conversation with a woman in a peacock-feathered mask. And near the grand staircase, the butler stood motionless, his face impassive, but his eyes watchful. Poirot approached Lady Beatrice, his manner polite but probing. "Madame, may I have a moment of your time?" She turned to him, her expression unreadable behind the mask. "Of course, Monsieur Poirot. What can I do for you?" "I understand you were acquainted with Mr. Whittaker," Poirot said, his tone conversational but his eyes keen. "Can you tell me about your last conversation with him?" Lady Beatrice hesitated, her fingers tightening around her fan. "We spoke briefly before the ball. He seemed preoccupied. He mentioned something about the ivory mask, but I didn't think much of it at the time." "Did he say anything specific about the mask?" Poirot pressed. She shook her head. "Only that it was more than it seemed. He said he had discovered something that could change everything." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "And did he mention who else might be interested in his discovery?" Lady Beatrice's gaze flicked to the man in the harlequin costume. "He didn't say, but I got the impression he didn't trust everyone in the room." Poirot followed her gaze, his mind racing. The man in the harlequin costume, Mr. Grayson, a rival art collector, was now speaking to Lord Blackwood, his gestures animated and his voice raised. "Thank you, madame. Poirot said, inclining his head. "You have been most helpful." He made his way to Lord Blackwood and Mr. Grayson, arriving just as their conversation turned heated. "This is absurd, Blackwood," Mr. Grayson snapped. "You can't seriously believe I had anything to do with Whittaker's disappearance." Lord Blackwood's face was flushed with anger. "You've been after the Ivory Mask for years, Grayson. Don't think I haven't noticed your interest." Poirot stepped between them, his voice calm but firm. "Monsieur, please. This is not the time for accusations. We must work together to uncover the truth." Mr. Grayson turned to Poirot, his eyes blazing behind his mask. "And what do you suggest, Monsieur Poirot? That we all sit around and wait for the next person to vanish?" "On the contrary," Poirot said, his tone steady. "I suggest we examine the facts. Mr. Whittaker disappeared after expressing interest in the Ivory Mask. The mask itself bears an inscription. The truth lies beneath the mask. And there are letters that suggest a secret so dangerous someone would kill to protect it." The room fell silent as Poirot's words sank in. The guests exchanged uneasy glances, their masks suddenly feeling like barriers rather than disguises. "What are you saying, Poirot?" Lord Blackwood asked, his voice tense. Poirot's gaze swept the room. "I am saying that one of you knows more than you are letting on. One of you is hiding behind a mask, not just of silk and lace, but of lies and deceit. And I intend to uncover the truth." As if on cue, the lights flickered, casting the room into momentary darkness. When they came back on, the Ivory Mask was gone from its pedestal, leaving behind only an empty space and a sense of foreboding. Poirot's eyes gleamed with determination. "The game is afoot, mes amis, and I do not intend to lose." Chapter 7. The Final Revelation. The disappearance of the Ivory Mask sent a wave of panic through the guests. Whispers turned to exclamations, and the once opulent ballroom now felt like a cage. Poirot, ever the calm in the storm, raised a hand to silence the room. "Mesdames et messieurs," he said, his voice carrying authority, "the time has come to end this charade. I invite you all to join me in the drawing-room, where I will reveal the truth behind Mr. Whittaker's disappearance and the secrets of the Ivory Mask." The guests exchanged uneasy glances, but followed Poirot to the drawing-room, where a fire crackled in the hearth, and the portraits of Blackwood ancestors seemed to watch with silent judgment. Poirot stood at the centre of the room, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes sharp and penetrating. "Let us begin," he said, "with the Ivory Mask. It is not merely an artifact, it is a symbol of betrayal, vengeance, and secrets that refuse to stay buried. The mask's inscription, 'The truth lies beneath the mask,' is both a clue and a warning, and tonight we shall uncover that truth." He turned to Lord Blackwood. "You, Lord Blackwood, have long believed the mask to be cursed. But the true curse lies not in the mask itself, but in the secrets it conceals. Your wife, Lady Eleanor, discovered one such secret, a secret so dangerous it cost her her life." Lord Blackwood's face went pale. "What are you saying, Poirot?" Poirot's gaze was steady. "I am saying that your wife did not die of natural causes. She was murdered, and her killer is in this room." A gasp rippled through the guests. Poirot continued, his voice calm but relentless. "The letters I found in the Whispering Gallery reveal that Lady Eleanor had uncovered a plot to steal the Blackwood fortune. She confided in someone she trusted, someone who betrayed her." He turned to Lady Beatrice, her gold filigree mask glinting in the firelight. "You, madame, were her closest friend. But you were also deeply in debt, were you not? And you saw an opportunity to save yourself by silencing Lady Eleanor and framing her death as an accident." Lady Beatrice's hands trembled, but she said nothing. Poirot pressed on. "You thought the secret would die with her, but you did not count on Mr. Whittaker. He too had discovered the truth, and he planned to expose you. That is why he disappeared." Poirot turned to Mr. Grayson, the man in the harlequin costume. "And you, monsieur, were not as innocent as you appeared. You sought to acquire the ivory mask, not for its beauty, but for the secrets it held. You conspired with Lady Beatrice to cover your tracks, but your greed blinded you to the danger." Finally, Poirot turned to the butler, who had remained silent throughout the evening. "And you, monsieur, were the linchpin of this scheme. You facilitated the theft of the mask, the disappearance of Mr. Whittaker, and the attempts to frame others. But you made one fatal mistake. You underestimated Hercule Poirot." The butler's mask slipped, revealing a face twisted with anger and fear. "You have no proof," he spat. Poirot smiled faintly. "On the contrary, the proof is in the mask itself." He held up the ivory mask, which he had discreetly retrieved earlier. "The inscription inside led me to a hidden compartment where I found this." He produced a small folded piece of paper and read aloud, "The truth lies beneath the mask and in the hands of those who seek to destroy it." The room fell silent as Poirot's words sank in. Lady Beatrice sank into a chair, her face pale. Mr. Grayson clenched his fists, his mask slipping to reveal his guilt. The butler stood motionless, his eyes darting toward the door. Poirot's voice was firm. "The game is over, mes amis. The truth has been unmasked." Chapter 8. The unmasking. The drawing-room was heavy with tension as Poirot's revelations sank in. Lady Beatrice sat slumped in her chair, her gold filigree mask discarded on the floor beside her. Mr. Grayson paced nervously, his harlequin costume now seeming garish and out of place. The butler stood rigid, his face a mask of defiance, though his trembling hands betrayed his fear. Lord Blackwood, his silver mask removed, looked at Poirot with a mixture of relief and sorrow. "You've done it, Monsieur Poirot. You've uncovered the truth. But at what cost? My wife's memory, my family's legacy, all tainted by this sordid affair." Poirot's expression was compassionate but firm. "The truth, Lord Blackwood, is rarely kind, but it is necessary. Without it, the cycle of deception and betrayal would have continued." He turned to Lady Beatrice, who was now weeping quietly. "Madame, your actions were driven by desperation, but they cannot be excused. You will face the consequences of your choices." She nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "I only wanted to protect myself. I never meant for any of this to happen." Poirot's gaze softened. "The masks we wear, madame, often conceal more than our faces. They hide our fears, our regrets, our darkest impulses. But in the end, the truth always finds a way to reveal itself. Next, he addressed Mr. Grayson, who had stopped pacing and now stood with his head bowed. "Monsieur, your greed blinded you to the humanity of those around you. You sought to exploit the secrets of the past for personal gain, but in doing so, you became a pawn in a much larger game." Mr. Grayson said nothing, his face a picture of shame. Finally, Poirot turned to the butler, who met his gaze with a defiant glare. "And you, monsieur, believed you could manipulate events from the shadows, but you underestimated the power of truth and the persistence of Hercule Poirot." The butler's defiance crumbled, and he sank to his knees. I only did what I thought was necessary," he muttered. Poirot's voice was stern. "Necessity does not justify deceit. You will answer for your crimes." With the guilty parties unmasked and the truth laid bare, Poirot turned to Lord Blackwood. "It is over, Lord Blackwood. The ivory mask will no longer cast its shadow over your family, but I urge you to learn from this tragedy. Secrets like masks may hide the truth, but they cannot erase it." Lord Blackwood nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Monsieur Poirot. I will never forget what you've done for me and for my family." As the guests were led away by the authorities, Poirot stood by the fireplace, the ivory mask in his hands. He studied its serene features, now seeming almost sorrowful in the flickering firelight. "The mask sees what others cannot," he murmured, recalling the note from Mr. Whittaker's room. "And it never forgets." He placed the mask on the mantelpiece, its empty eyes staring out into the room. "But it is not the mask that holds the truth," he said to himself. "It is the courage to remove it." Epilogue. The next morning, Poirot stood at the gates of Blackwood Manor, his suitcase in hand. Lord Blackwood approached, his face weary, but resolute. "Will you stay for breakfast, Monsieur Poirot?" he asked. Poirot shook his head. "Non, merci. My work here is done. But I trust you will find peace, Lord Blackwood. The past may haunt us, but it does not define us." As the carriage pulled away, Poirot leaned back in his seat, his mind already turning to the next mystery. But for a moment he allowed himself to reflect on the events at Blackwood Manor. "Masks," he mused aloud. "They hide so much, yet reveal even more. And in the end, it is not the mask that matters, but the face beneath." And with that, Hercule Poirot departed, his little grey cells already buzzing with anticipation for the next challenge. The end. I hope you enjoyed Hercule Poirot and the Ivory Mask Mystery, the face that hid a deadly deception. Let me know if you'd like to explore another story or mystery.